Well, hello everybody, and welcome to all of our viewers. I'm Angela Bischoff, Director of the Ontario Clean Air Alliance, a nonprofit organization working for 100% renewably powered Ontario, and I'll be your MC today. Tonight's event was motivated by the release of a new documentary film called The Atom, a Love Affair. Let's watch the trailer now.
Right now, I'd like to bring you a different kind of story. In its own way, it's just as dramatic as anything a writer could dream up. It has to do with a new power source. This power source is the atom.
The atom, a thing of wonder, the building block of the universe.
You know her?
Not very well. I wish I did.
But with the power to destroy it too.
Of good or of evil? Who will decide which it shall be?
The challenge was irresistible.
I don't know how many times I've heard you go on the same way about some man or other.
No, but this is different, Liz. Really it is. This time it's the real thing.
They were like inside a secret. This very, very elite group of special people.
You felt very proud to be part of this thing that keeps the country's power going.
He really has it.
Il était clair pour la France que son salut, c'était le nucléaire.
When I first went to the States as a minister, I was told that they had a policy of 2,000 nuclear power stations by the year 2000. But the local opposition was so strong that they couldn't build them.
That period of time left us with a scorecard of about 4-0 in favour of Greenpeace, to be quite honest with you.
The answer is no.
3 Mile Island basically made clear that accidents could happen. In fact, serious accidents.
When we did find out the truth of the economics, how much worse it was than we were told, understandably, people's trust in nuclear was very low.
Es gibt keine nukleare Renaissance. Das ist ein Märchen aus der Propagandaabteilung.
Atomic energy is unnecessary.
The world must have nuclear power as soon as possible.
It is undemocratic.
Make no mistake about it, this is an important day for Britain.
And it is a travesty on our descendants.
Advocates and opponents of nuclear power just didn't speak the same language.
In the annals of love, it's an affair like no other.
So that's the trailer of the feature-length film. The Ontario Clean Air Alliance is premiering the film in Canada. To date, it has only been shown in the UK. This is the first time North Americans can view the film. You can watch the film until July 4th by going to a site which I and the filmmaker are co-hosting. I will put the link in the chat bar. Believe me, it's worth the 90 minutes. In just a few minutes, we'll speak with the filmmaker and then with Canadians that are working for a nuclear-free country. But first, I come to you from the city of Toronto on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse nations, Inuit and Métis people. The agenda of this 90-minute webinar is this: 4 speakers, each getting 10 minutes to present, and each followed by 5 minutes of questions from the audience. Please post your comments in the chat bar and your questions in the Q&A section. And both of those sections can be accessed by going to the proper sections at the bottom of your screen. I'll try to get to your questions after each speaker, and then at the very end, There will be, if all goes well, a half an hour for discussion and questions for all the speakers. First, I'd like to introduce to you our speakers. Vicki Leslie is a British filmmaker with her own company, Tenor Films. She's been working in documentaries for over 20 years. She's the director and producer of The Atom, A Love Affair, the trailer which we just watched. Susan O'Donnell is a researcher and adjunct professor at the University of New Brunswick, formerly a senior researcher at the National Research Council of Canada, where she specialized in studies of technology adoption. Brenaine Lloyd is the director of Northwatch, a multi-issue environmental, social justice, and peace organization that has existed in northeastern Ontario since the late 80s. The issue of nuclear waste has been a high priority for Brenaine for decades. She manages several websites, including KnowNuclearWaste.ca, NuclearWaste.ca, and StopSMRs.ca. Gordon Edwards is the director of the Canadian Coalition for Nuclear Responsibility. He has dedicated decades of his life to education and research on all issues related to nuclear energy, whether civilian or military. And once again, I'll put everybody's links in the chat bar. I'll also send out an email after this event with relevant links for you to follow up on all these individuals, plus everything that we discussed today. Because all of you are registered to have your emails, I'll send you a follow-up email. So we've got an all-star cast of panelists today, so let's get started. Vicki, congratulations on the final 2020 release of your feature-length film, The Atom, A Love Affair. You've been working on this film for over a decade. I know that you crowdfunded to pay for it. I even contributed many years ago, and it's a brilliant film. Tell us about your process, what motivated you to take on this giant historical film project, and what did you learn from it all?
Well, yeah, it's as I think the crowdfunder you were talking about was, I think, in 2016, which in the journey of the film seems to me relatively recent. I was thinking back over sort of how it all started, and it's slightly shocking to me to realize it was actually the very first kind of germ of the idea that I had to make a film on this subject was in 2006, which I was a little shocked to realize was 15 years ago now, which is a really, really long time. But it basically came about, I was working in TV, just in kind of mainstream TV documentaries I'd made, nothing like terribly kind of edifying really. I'd made a series about UFOs and another series for Channel 4 in the UK about people who believed that they were vampires and they needed to drink human blood, like very kind of trashy films really. So I was kind of having a little bit of a crisis. I was turning 30 and I was thinking, like, you know, I didn't go into documentaries to make films about kind of, you know, these kinds of things. So what can I do? And around that time in my 20s, I did a lot of campaigning, sort of environmental campaigning. I did a lot of stuff with Greenpeace and also kind of global poverty campaigning. And so I was looking to those kinds of subjects for kind of what I might make a film about. And really nuclear power was, and I look back, it's become this huge thing in my life. You know, I spent more than, as you said, more than a decade making this film. But, you know, I obviously, when I thought in 2006 I'd like to make a film about nuclear power, I had absolutely no idea I would be doing that for years and years and years to come. So, I mean, it was kind of by chance. It was just in the news, basically. It was around 2005, 2006, as is in the film, you know, there was this kind of push in a lot of places to have a sort of nuclear renaissance. And the British Prime Minister, Tony Blair, having been much more opposed to nuclear in opposition, was suddenly had this kind of about turn, and he famously said the nuclear power was back on the agenda with a vengeance. I was kind of talking with my Greenpeace friends about this notion of making a film, and it kind of came in the conversation about nuclear power. And, you know, at that time, I look back, I was quite ignorant really. And in fact, I think I even was a little hazy in my own mind about the difference between even nuclear power and nuclear weapons. You know, I remember Chernobyl. I was a school kid in the 80s. I remember it as a very scary thing, but I'm not sure I completely really differentiated Chernobyl from Hiroshima, which was another big scary nuclear thing, you know. And it was kind of, I was pretty ignorant really. So I thought to myself, well, you know, this is something that's happening in the news. There's a debate. Maybe I can make a film to be part of this debate. Well, it turned out I realized quite quickly it's hard to make films on your own. You know, like I was used to working in kind of TV where broadcasters would pay you to make a program. No broadcasters were wanting to pay me to make a film about nuclear power. So I was doing it on my own. So initially, for the first probably about 5 years, I was doing little bits of crowdfunding. I made a whole bunch of different short films about different parts of the nuclear story. And kind of through the process of doing that, I mean, I was just doing that on the side, you know, while I was still working in TV. And I gradually just got more and more interested in the history. While I was researching, one of the things that struck me was that there wasn't, considering that it was in the news, there wasn't that much kind of current stuff that I could find beyond, I guess, kind of a few campaign briefings from Greenpeace and people. But, you know, a lot of the books and things, a lot of them seemed to be from the late 70s, early 80s. So I was kind of getting immersed into that period just to research the subject. And what struck me was a lot of the same arguments that I was hearing in 2006 or 2008 or whatever, of why we needed more nuclear power, were the exact same arguments I was reading in these books from the early 80s. But obviously it was many, many years later and a lot of things had happened in between. And I was just struck by that. And I was also at the same time kind of going down this rabbit hole of the archive. And I kind of I fell in love really with archive footage in making this film. And, you know, it was because I was making it completely for myself, there was no broadcaster who kind of saying, this is the film we want. I was free to just follow the paths I wanted and kind of, you know, go where the story and the research was taking me. So, you know, as I said, initially, I thought I was making a film that would be kind of part of a debate of should we have more nuclear power? But actually, as time went on, well, one thing was this renaissance kind of wasn't really happening as I was, you know, carrying on trying to raise money to make this film. And as I said, I got more and more interested in the arguments and how I was kind of hearing a lot of the same arguments. So it kind of slowly morphed into focusing more on the kind of PR and the arguments and the kind of story that had been told about nuclear. So I finally, as I said, I did do crowdfunding. I also raised some private investment. I got sort of tax credit money from the UK government to, you know, to support British films. And I was finally ready I did the bulk of the filming. Most of the interviews in the film were recorded in around sort of 2013 time, which is, you know, that's a long time ago from now really. Although I don't think it's dated particularly because it's a historical kind of record. But one of the things, 2013 obviously was post Fukushima, and it was also really quite a few years after this initial kind of rush of excitement about the Renaissance. The Renaissance was becoming more and more clear was not really happening in the way that, you know, the advocates were wanting it to. And one of the things I was really struck by when I was doing the filming, I was also quite heavily pregnant when I did a lot of these interviews. So I felt there was this real kind of contrast in a way between not everybody I interviewed was a sort of old man, but many of them were. And a lot of them came from, you know, they had a particular kind of mindset about the world and you know, their views about nuclear power were part of a bigger view about kind of society and technology. And I felt that I was almost this kind of like visible manifestation of a kind of different way of looking at the world. You know, it's kind of a bit of a cliche, but it's something I got very interested in exploring in the film, you know, how different people would see the same technology, but in such a different way. And one of the things that really struck me was just how very emotional a lot of those guys were about the technology, which completely made sense to me. You know, they devoted their life to this technology that certainly, and I came to really understand a lot more the appeal, particularly in the early decades of this, you know, shiny new modern technology. And, you know, these guys had spent, in some cases, decades working on it. And it just, you know, it had never really kind of lived up to what they were hoping for. And now this new renaissance was also kind of stuttering. And, you know, that was difficult, and could be quite painful in a way. So the film that, you know, that exists now, the love affair, the Atom, a love affair, that the love affair element was actually quite a late addition That only came in when we were editing. And it was one of those almost kind of little bits of magic that happened in the edit when I was, talking with my editor, and we were his full rise, but where were we at now? And, I can't recall now whether it was me or my editor or who first had this thought about the love affair, but I'm getting a message that my connection's unstable, so I hope you can still hear me. Yeah, we kind of, as we started to try and plot this metaphor of a love affair onto the story, it just seemed to work really, really well. The idea of the atom as this kind of sort of roguish, dashing, lover that promised, was very, very charming and promised lots of things, but sort of didn't really follow through, and then would beg for another chance and have another chance, and it seemed to plot on really well. So that's where the love affair thing came from. And God, in terms of what I learned, I mean, I sort of joke that I've done my own kind of independent sort of PhD almost. I've learned tons. So, I mean, in a way, I'd kind of rather hear from the rest of the experts, really. What I've learned is in the film, I guess. So, please do watch the film. And I must say, I don't know very much at all about the Canadian situation. That's not an area that I've researched. So I'm excited and interested to hear from all of the other speakers, and I'm sure I will learn even more this evening.
Thanks, Vicki. I just have one quick question. I don't know if the chat bar seems to be working, but we're working on it. We're trying to, like, if you're watching, maybe pop something in the chat bar. You can send messages to panelists or all attendees, but we're having some troubles here. Okay, I just saw something popping up, so maybe this is happening. Vicki, one quick question. I noticed that your film stopped short of actually addressing small modular nuclear reactors, or SMRs, which is what we're dealing with here in Canada. And I'm wondering, was it just an issue of timing, or what was the reason?
It was really, I mean, I should say that, like as you mentioned, you contributed to that crowdfunder in 2016. The film was basically finished in 2017. Because it's so full of archive, many things, when I look back, I've really understood how extraordinarily expensive it is, particularly the sort of commercial, news archive. Would I, maybe, I don't know. I don't know. I mean, I'm like £100,000 personally still in debt on having made this film. Most of that has come from the archive. So once we were finished, we were kind of stuck for some time to try and raise money to clear the archive. We were able to do a few later, very late in the day interviews. The guy from Siemens, the German guy, he was a very late interview, and also the French guy from Arriva. So that's how we were able to address Brexit having happened. But yeah, basically, I mean, there was, it's always one of these issues as well with a history film, at when is the film finished? I mean, there was also, I did a webinar couple of months ago here with some academics at the University of Sussex who are doing some, which is actually where I live, that's my local university. They're doing some really interesting work about kind of current links between the British civil nuclear program and the weapons program. And, as time goes on and it becomes more and more really hard on the face of it to understand why we're still going for nuclear power as a source of electricity, as renewables are getting cheaper and cheaper and nuclear is getting more and more expensive and hard to build. Why is that happening? They're making some interesting arguments that perhaps that's actually a military question. I'd have loved to have included some of that in the film, but it was just too late in the day. And the SMRs is much the same, really. It was kind of, and I'm not sure as well that it's certainly in the UK, it's Rolls-Royce are doing something a little bit in that area, I think, but we're still mainly focusing on these big, we're building a big nuclear power plant, Hinkley Point C in Somerset, and there are a couple of other, big traditional big power stations on the pipeline, and that's where the focus of most kind of British campaigning, I think, is. So
Great,
I'm
Vicki.
really interested to learn.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Excellent. Well, I'll definitely circulate your film link around, and hopefully we can get more people watching it. Okay, I'd like to turn my attention now to Susan. Susan, you are new to the scene. You've gotten very active in just the last year, building opposition to the latest push for new nukes in Canada, called SMRs, or SMRs, small modular nuclear reactors. Can you tell us, what they are, who exactly is pushing these new reactors, and why Canadians should care about this?
Sure. Well, thanks, Angela. Thanks for inviting me on the panel. And Vicki, I love the film. And thanks very much for spending all those years working on it. So I have a research project at the University of New Brunswick called RAVEN, Rural Action and Voices for the Environment. I'm in Fredericton on unceded Wolastoq territory. So as you said, Angela, I'm fairly new to this. Up until about 2 years ago, I knew that New Brunswick had a nuclear plant at Point Lepreau on the Bay of Fundy. We're the only province in New Brunswick outside of Ontario with an operational nuclear power reactor. And I knew that its end of life was in about 20 years, but I had no idea that there were plans to replace it with new nuclear. I just assumed that we were going to go down a renewable energy path in New Brunswick. And then 2 years ago, when I first heard about these so-called small modular nuclear reactors, or SMRs, I looked at the information available on the government website and our public utility, NB Power, and there was so much information missing. It was just so obvious. There was no information about nuclear waste that the new reactors would produce. There was no information about the cost, the environmental impacts. So I started to look into it. And since that time, I've spent many, many hours researching and speaking with experts. And what I found was very disturbing. So our RAVEN project was part of a group of environmental organizations that brought Gordon Edwards to New Brunswick in March last year. And after his visit, we formed the Coalition for Responsible Energy Development in New Brunswick. And I sit on the core member group as the representative for the RAVEN project. The film does talk about the nuclear industry's claims that nuclear energy is required for climate action. So I want to state clearly up front that my review of peer-reviewed research has convinced me and many other people that there's no way that the proposed new reactors, the SMRs, will contribute to climate action. And this is basically why we should care about this, because the reactors proposed are way too slow. They likely, based on past performance, won't even work. They're way too expensive, and they're going to suck up billions of dollars in public funding if the industry gets its way. And if they can possibly get them to work, these SMRs are going to create another legacy of new kinds of nuclear waste that future generations will be paying to maintain forever. One of the aspects of the film that I really liked is that it shows how the industry and government use propaganda to sell the nuclear dream. And I think it's important to remember that the nuclear industry has played a big part in creating the climate crisis by selling this dream of limitless energy, of boundless energy, the idea that we can all just use as much as we want because eventually nuclear energy will come through. They've had a century of peddling that dream to Canadians, and of course their dream hasn't panned out. The twisted irony is that now, after playing a big role in creating the climate crisis, the nuclear industry is selling the idea that nuclear energy will help end the climate crisis, specifically SMRs. So as far as who and what is pushing nuclear reactors in Canada, I think there's really three things that it's important to focus on to understand what's behind the push. One is that the nuclear industry is desperate. The nuclear industry is desperate to save itself. The nuclear industry is a division of the public utilities in New Brunswick and Ontario, NB Power, Ontario Power Generation, and Bruce Power. And all of these have CANDU nuclear reactors operating that have an end of life coming up. And there's no way that Canada is going to build more of these CANDU reactors. They haven't been that successful. So the industry sees SMRs as their way to save the industry. And as an immediate indication of how desperate they are, the SMRs under review currently, there's between 8 and 12 of them. They're all different competing designs. They're very different from the current reactors in Canada, the CANDU reactors. They have different cooling systems, use different kinds of fuel. The industry has no idea if any of them are going to work. So they're just throwing everything out there, trying desperately to make something happen the something being getting more public money for the industry. The nuclear industry has a very powerful lobby right behind the oil and gas lobby. The sales and marketing function is pumping out endless materials. They're organizing events, partnering with organizations and groups that are willing to take their money. And the propaganda that is being pumped out about SMRs is extreme, everything from half-truths to outright lies. For example, the industry is promoting the idea that extracting plutonium from used CANDU fuel, which the propagandists call recycling nuclear fuel, they say that this is going to be an affordable way to fuel new reactors and solve the problem of nuclear waste. And if you read any of the peer-reviewed research, you'll find out very quickly that this is just nonsense. It's nonsense. Another reason why these are being pushed is really there's at least two nuclear industries. There's the nuclear power industry and the nuclear waste industry. So nuclear waste is a huge industry in Canada. So you have, as I mentioned, the public utilities that are generating nuclear power, but private industry is involved in all aspects of nuclear power, as well as cleaning up the mess that the nuclear industry has made, which is the nuclear waste. So companies such as Cnsc Lavalin in Canada, but also American companies are involved in the nuclear waste industry. They're also involved in nuclear weapons manufacturing in the US that are very involved in the nuclear waste industry. So there's a lot of public money involved. And whenever there's money at this level involved, you'll have a lot of pressure to keep the public money flowing. So just for an example, Canadian Nuclear Laboratories, which is a private consortium that involves Cnsc Lavalin that's funded by public money, is conducting research now in Chalk River, Ontario on extracting plutonium from used nuclear fuel. And so far, the federal government has given more than $50 million in public funds to Moltex for this plutonium extraction scheme. I don't know how much they're paying for the research in Chalk River. The New Brunswick government has given them $5 million, and Moltex is currently preparing grant applications for even more public money, and you can bet they're going to be asking for a lot more. And then finally, I would say another push for these new reactors is that the federal and provincial governments are captured by the nuclear industry. And their primary concern is to save the nuclear industry. The primary concern of the governments is to save the nuclear industry rather than ensure the public interest. So on the federal level, we have the main departments involved are Natural Resources Canada, Innovation, Science and Economic Development Canada, and the regional economic development agencies in the Atlantic. In my case, that's ACOA. They all have a core mandate for industrial development. That's what they do. The departments federally that we would hope to be primarily focused on the public interests, such as Health Canada and Environment Canada, are either also captured by industry or really asleep at the wheel because they are not speaking up when clearly they should be. And the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, when it comes to these SMRs, is also captured. They created this money-making scheme for themselves called vendor design reviews that certify that the nuclear reactor proponents understand the regulations of the CNSC, and it's really just a farce. The interesting thing about this push for SMRs by the government is how it's transferring public money to the private sector. When the CANDU reactors were being built in the 1970s and 1980s, the federal money went directly to the public utilities, not to the private sector companies. And the money went to public utilities in Ontario, Quebec, and New Brunswick. But Quebec got out of the nuclear power business almost 10 years ago, although they still have a forever legacy of nuclear waste. So politically now, it's very difficult for the federal government to hand over millions and maybe billions of dollars to public sector utilities in Ontario and New Brunswick only. So the solution they've come up with is to hand it over to private companies and call it industrial development. In one federal funding pocket alone, there's $8 billion available for new nuclear development for private sector companies. So just to conclude, I just want to say that when it comes to climate action, nuclear is not a solution. We have much better options and it's not required. And from an activist point of view, there's a lot of work to do. We need to keep asking questions, to keep sharing information about these SMRs. And I would encourage everyone watching here to spread the word, talk with your friends, your neighbors and family. And those of us working on this issue are convinced that the more people learn about small modular nuclear reactors, the more they'll be opposed to spending public funds on developing them. And that once we reach a critical mass of people opposed to expanding nuclear infrastructure in Canada, political parties will take notice and do something about it, we hope. Some analysts of social movements say that it will take another critical nuclear accident to change the tide of public opinion, like Fukushima or Chernobyl. Obviously, we're hoping that will not happen, but when it does, the anti-nuclear movement will be ready with information for the public that the industry and the government will never provide. So there you go, Angela. That's my spiel on my take on what's happening.
Wow, that's just overwhelming. All the money and political influence and government collusion and industry interference, and it's really overwhelming. I don't see any questions, so I'm just going to move on, and we'll address a whole new topic here that augments what you're talking about, and that is with Brenane. Brenane, you've been working for 3 decades to defend Ontario's communities from the ravages of uranium mining and now more recently nuclear waste disposal. Can you tell us why nuclear waste is such a danger to our communities and what the industry hopes to do with all the deadly radioactive wastes they've generated over the past 70 years?
Yes, thanks, Angela. So I'm Brenane Lloyd. I'm joining from Robinson Huron Treaty area in the territory of Nipissing First Nation and Quebec First Nation, which is unceded Algonquin territory. The organization I work with works with through the territories of Anishinaabe Nation and Anishinaabe Nation. But for decades, we've also worked with our colleagues and neighbors in Northwestern Ontario, which is Anishinaabe Nation and Treaty 3 territory. It's a big story. I'm gonna really do a flyover in 10 minutes around the status, the risk, the challenges with radioactive waste. What the industry would like to do is to solve their public relations problem. What they'd like to do is to be able to say that the problem is solved, and everything, their programs are geared to that end. It's about getting to yes. It's about getting to say that the problem is solved. But we have problems all along the nuclear chain because radioactive waste, nuclear waste, is generated at every step along the along the nuclear chain. Starting with uranium mining, which you mentioned. We haven't had uranium mining in our region for decades, but we have 200 million tons of radioactive acid generating uranium tailings in what I think can be considered to be temporary management because they require ongoing monitoring, maintenance. They're on surface, they're in dams and dikes, and there's risk. There's constant risk. Uranium tailings are not only, and uranium in general, it's radioactive, so there's issues there, but it's also toxic. So, and in the case of the uranium tailings in the Serpent River Basin, they're also acid generating, so they're leaching other metals out. But we move along the chain, and at every step, now the uranium mining now in Canada is concentrated in the Athabasca Basin in northern Saskatchewan. As we move along the nuclear chain, there's waste generated at every step. So you go from uranium mining to refining, which still happens in our region at the largest uranium refinery in the world in Blind River on the north shore of Lake Huron, and then to fuel production, which happens at Port Hope, Toronto, and Peterborough. And each of those stages generate their own radioactive waste. But what's very frustrating for public interest groups and concerned members of those communities is that it's very difficult to track what wastes are being generated, what are the waste qualities, what are their quantities, and where are they going? Even though each of those facilities are licensed under the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission and the associated regulations, and even those licenses require the operators to provide an inventory of their waste, they simply don't. They simply do not. And so it's very difficult to track those wastes, where they're going, and what the hazards are. We move a little along the chain and we come to nuclear power reactors. And then we get into a huge range of different wastes, different radionuclides, different hazards, different systems for at least temporarily managing or containing these wastes. So what the wastes need, here's the challenge. The challenge is to isolate these wastes from the environment into perpetuity. And I would say the industry is failing at every step. So from the reactor, there's low, intermediate, and high level waste. The industry, the nuclear power industry in Canada, and I know I'm most familiar with Ontario, they really have no plan for the long-term isolation or management or containment of any of these wastes, although they will tell you that they have a plan for the high level waste. They did have what they would have called a project. They called a project, I would have called a scheme for the burial of low and intermediate level waste beneath the Bruce Nuclear Generating Station, less than a kilometer from the shore of Lake Huron. And that was an idea that they pursued for over a decade. And in 2020, it was rejected by Saugeen Ojibwe Nation, and OPG is basically bereft of any plans at this point. But there are activities, and some of these activities are of real concern. One of, I'll mention just two of them. So one is that large volumes of the low-level waste is incinerated at the Bruce Nuclear Generating Station in what's called the Western Waste Management Facility. And that is to go back to the old adage of the solution to pollution is dilution. These wastes are, the industry will describe that as volume reduction, but in effect, there's some release and there's some dispersion. Really, I think in the very, very long term, that's what these ideas of deep geological repositories are also about. They're not going to contain the waste into perpetuity, but they will slow the movement of those radionuclides to the surface. But I digress. Back to the low-level waste, the other activity that I think is of concern, and which is really very much below the public radar, although we've raised it repeatedly with the regulator to no effect, is that there is a trafficking of low-level radioactive waste. And as Susan mentioned, the private industry are big players in the nuclear sector in Ontario, in Canada. And I believe increasingly, although maybe it's just that we've uncovered in more recent years, the US and international companies are big players. So there's a practice of moving low-level radioactive waste from Canadian generators to the US for what they call processing, which could be incineration, could be compaction, very little information available. And then by US law, they are required to return what's the residual, so sort of the boiled down version of that waste. But what's really, two items of real concern. One is there's no tracking of it. There's no registry. There's no publicly available accounting of what waste is going where and what's coming back. And these are multi-site licenses. So we have looked at a number of licenses that have 9 different generators on the same license. So from 3 Cameco facilities, 3 Canadian Nuclear Laboratory facilities, 3 Ontario power generation facilities, it's all on the same license, and it all goes to the US for processing and then returns. And it can return to any of those 9 facilities. So theoretically, according to these licenses, we could have waste from Pickering being returned to the Blind River Uranium Refinery. Well, that's not the case because there's no capacity to deal with even their own waste at the Blind River Refinery, but the licenses would allow that. So that's just the low. Intermediate, more problematic. High level waste, more problematic. So high level waste in Canada is the spent fuel, the irradiated fuel, the reactor fuel waste. High level waste is what it's called. So these are highly radioactive. uranium-filled fuel bundles. They go in their uranium, they come out 18 months later. There are more than 200 different radioactive isotopes, extremely radioactive, and will have to be isolated from the environment into perpetuity, hundreds of thousands of years. At the starting point, they're put into irradiated fuel base, cooling pools at the reactor station. And there are problems with those irradiated fuel bays, which it has taken us considerable time to uncover. And it's only through engaging in license reviews and digging down and digging down and digging down in the documents, you find that there are releases from these irradiated fuel bays into the groundwater. And again, it's very difficult to track the releases. We have tried repeatedly, have argued that we should have the groundwater monitoring results, and OPG has refused it. The commission, the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, has agreed that it should be publicly available, but yet it is not. So that's in the short term. Then we move to the medium term. It's put into dry storage. These are dry storage containers. The most recent to be constructed at Pickering are going to be constructed immediately at the lake's edge. So the least secure site, the least secure location you could find within that site. And there is no, there's been no movement in decades on the part of Canadian industry or the Canadian regulator to improve the robustness, the security of the dry storage containers. There's also very limited information available. When we have had participant funding to retain experts to review the dry storage containers to ascertain how effective are they. Our experts have told us that there's not enough information available for them to do a technical review. So there's a lot of questions even at the dry storage stage. But we do know that the fuel is the most vulnerable when it's in the irradiated fuel bay to human error, to loss of cooling from water, loss of input from power, to malevolent acts. It's at its most vulnerable. And yet the waste lingers in the irradiated fuel bays, in the Ontario reactors at least. And we've done just a very easy calculation looking at the amount of time the fuel has been, looking at different volumes each year over a number of, over a 20-year period, and have determined that the majority of the waste, the industry says the waste has to stay in the pool for 8 to 10 years. There is about 2/3 of the waste is still in the pool. About twice as much waste is in the pool as needs to be in the pool. And Angela's giving me the sign, the time sign, when we're at the issue, which is, looms largest from our perspective, and that is the long-term management of high-level waste, nuclear fuel waste. And there is a plan. Again, I'd call it more a scheme. 1977, 3 men, 3 months, studied the problem of high-level waste and said, let's bury it. And the industry, government, and regulator have followed down that track ever since. In the 1990s, we had a 10-year review of a concept, and that panel review at the end determined that the concept, Atomic Energy of Canada Limited's concept of burying the nuclear waste in the Canadian Shield had not been demonstrated to be safe and acceptable. The federal government said we accept those in principle, and then they turned around and they put the absolute opposite, the opposite to the panel's recommendations into action, which was they directed the industry to organize themselves into an agency for the long-term management. And that's the Nuclear Waste Management Organization. And for 10 years, 11 years now, they have been conducting a site search for a community they call a willing community. And they say an informed community, although the information available from the Nuclear Waste Management Organization is so limited and so all the hard edges have been rounded off. So it's difficult to think that a community could become informed, truly informed, if they were relying on the NWMO's information alone. They're now down to 2 communities, one in Northwestern Ontario, Haida Land in the Revel Lake area, between 2 large, significant watersheds, and another in Southwestern Ontario in a farming community, in the heart of the farming community. And they say by 2023, they will make a decision. There's no operating deep geological repository licensed anywhere in the world, despite 40 years of effort on the part of the nuclear industry. And I know I'm out of time, and I hope you'll ask me a question. Thank you.
Yes, we have one question now, and I'm sure there'll be more later, but here's a very specific question. Is the CNSC responsible for collecting the data about radioactive waste products being created at each level of the nuclear fuel chain? Why are they not enforcing this information and making it public? And that's from Brian Beaton.
So they're responsible for ensuring that each licensee includes that information in each license renewal application or in each new application. And I would say in summary, they're not doing it. There are various inventories produced by, a kind of a combination of the players, Atomic Energy of Canada Limited, Natural Resources Canada. It's produced, and every 3 years, there's this joint report required under a convention that Canada is a signature to, but they're incomplete. And particularly they're incomplete when you look at the earlier stages in the fuel chain, and they're incomplete when you look at the later stages, intermediate and high level waste. We don't have consistent, reliable inventories, and you look from one inventory to another, and there are differences and contradictions. So we don't, and part of this is the problem of not having an independent agency to direct and require that these things are done. And we don't have that. We have a regulator, but we don't have an independent waste management agency or even a review board the way other countries do. And that's a real gap for Canada.
Thank you so much, Bernane, for your decades of commitment to this issue. Okay, on to Gordon. Gordon, you too have devoted your life to understanding and communicating the dangers of the nuclear fuel chain across Canada, from uranium mining to processing, refining, fuel fabrication, reactor operations, and nuclear waste handling. This latest push for SMRs now brings with it a new and very serious problem, that of nuclear weapons proliferation. Can you tell us more about this and why we should be concerned?
I just unmuted myself, so I hope my voice is coming through now. Thank you very much, Angela. I came at this issue in the first place through nuclear weapons. An existential threat to the human race is the human race. And the reason why is because we've developed doomsday machines in the form of nuclear weapons, which are capable of destroying human civilization within a matter of hours. And the difficulty is that these arsenals still exist, and they're now being renewed. They're being refurbished and expanded. So that the threat of nuclear war, which has been diminishing in recent decades, is on the verge of now becoming more pronounced. And it's coming to the point now where any nuclear war, as the nuclear weapons spread around the world, any war can turn into a nuclear war. And once a nuclear war starts, it's extremely difficult to keep it limited. But even a limited nuclear war between 2 nuclear armed opponents, such as, for example, India and Pakistan, even a limited nuclear war involving only a few dozen nuclear weapons rather than the tens of thousands that exist, would cause climate change on a global scale very rapidly. That would make it very difficult for all life on Earth to actually produce enough food, to get enough sunlight, and to actually continue. So it's not only global warming that is an existential threat to the planet, human caused, but it's also these nuclear weapons. And that's where uranium and plutonium come in. Because the very first nuclear reactors were built for one single purpose, and that was to produce the plutonium that's needed for nuclear weapons. And during the Cold War, there were tens of thousands of nuclear weapons built, and the primary nuclear explosive in these weapons is plutonium, which is a derivative of uranium and which has to be created. It doesn't exist in nature. It's only created inside a nuclear reactor, and it's created inside every nuclear reactor, whatever the purpose of that reactor may be. Moreover, plutonium has a half-life of 24,000 years, which means that after being created, it is virtually indestructible, and it will be around for tens of thousands of years to come. So we are creating, at every time we build a nuclear reactor, we're creating a repository of plutonium, something that nature did not provide us with, we are graciously providing. Now, unlike natural uranium, when you dig uranium out of the ground, you can't use it directly as a nuclear explosive material. For example, if somebody stole CANDU fuel bundles destined for a Canadian nuclear reactor, they couldn't make a bomb out of that. Because why? Because the explosive variety of uranium in nature is mixed with overwhelming amounts of non-explosive uranium. And as a result, the mixture can't be used. It has to be highly enriched, and that's a very difficult, sophisticated, and technologically enhanced and energy intensive process. It's something that only countries that have nuclear weapons, or usually countries that have some idea of maybe getting nuclear weapons, have that technology. Canada does not. But every reactor produces plutonium, and plutonium, when separated from the irradiated fuel, all plutonium can be used to make bombs. So that you don't need enrichment. You don't need anything but a chemical separation plant that is sufficiently shielded so that you can handle the intense radiation that is created by the high-level radioactive waste. People perhaps do not understand that even though a normal fuel bundle before it goes into the reactor can be handled safely with gloves, once it comes out of the reactor, it'll kill any human being in a matter of seconds because of a blast of gamma radiation coming from those that were mentioned by Brennan. What are these byproducts? They are the broken pieces of uranium and plutonium atoms that have been split. The energy of the atom is released by splitting the atoms. And when they're split, you get hundreds of broken pieces. And these broken pieces are millions of times more radioactive and lethal to even come close for any human being. And that's what protects the plutonium. The reason why right now it's not so easy to get the plutonium out and to use it for bombs is because it would kill any human being that comes close to it. So while this is done by superpowers and by nuclear arms, it's not done by other countries. In fact, the only country that extracts plutonium from spent fuel that doesn't have nuclear weapons is Japan. And that's highly controversial and nerve-wracking for the neighbors of Japan, because at any time, that separated plutonium can easily be incorporated into nuclear weapons. And so you can go from a stockpile of so-called civilian plutonium, and you can turn it into a nuclear arsenal in short order. So this was my main concern, and this is how I got involved in the nuclear question in the first place. And then I discovered that most of the early reactors in Canada, in the US, in Russia, in England, they were all dual purpose reactors. That is, while they were producing electricity, they were also producing plutonium for bombs. Here in Canada, even though we didn't have a bomb program, we sold plutonium from our research reactors at Chalk River for 30 years after 1945, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We sold our plutonium to the American military for bombs. At the same time, by the way, we were selling all of our uranium up until 1965 to the American military, specifically for weapons purposes. So Canada is not the innocent bystander that many people might think. In fact, we were part of the Manhattan Project. In 1943, there was a meeting between Winston Churchill, President Roosevelt, and our Prime Minister, Mackenzie King, to sign a tripartite secret agreement called the Quebec Accord. And this was an agreement to cooperate to develop the world's first nuclear weapons. And part of the agreement was that the weapons would not be used against each other, and they would not be used against a third party except by unanimous consent. So our prime minister had to consent to the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Now, Canadian uranium was used not only to build the Hiroshima bomb, which was made out of highly enriched uranium, but also the Nagasaki bomb, which was made from plutonium, because uranium is the feedstock to make the plutonium. So what we're now witnessing is that in its desperate effort to keep the ball rolling and keep the money rolling in, the nuclear industry is now proposing to extract plutonium from irradiated nuclear fuel that already exists. The problem with that is that as soon as you extract plutonium, and why do they want to do this? Because they say that we can use that plutonium as a fuel in place of the uranium. In fact, this is a dream that the nuclear industry has had for a long time. The idea of entering the golden age of the plutonium economy, where everything, the whole world, in fact, will be running on plutonium. This is a nightmarish prospect because that means that plutonium would become an article of commerce. It would become something that is traded and shipped around the world, and thousands of people would be aware of these shipments. It's inevitable that these will fall into the hands of criminals and then into the hands of terrorists, as well as into the hands of various nations which may not even have nuclear weapons or nuclear power. They can get a hold of this plutonium, and we're creating a nightmarish possibility for the world. In fact, much has been written about this, and you can Google the plutonium economy. The Harvard Law School printed a document years ago called Policing Plutonium, the Civil Liberties Fallout, in which they go into great detail about how this would fundamentally change society itself, because it means that you would have to have really a military dictatorship, because you couldn't afford to allow people to get their hands on this plutonium and then to be able to, as somebody once said in that context, we could wake up one morning and find Washington, D.C. gone and have no idea who did it. So this is a terrible possibility. And we in Canada, unfortunately, through misrepresentation by the nuclear proponents, are on the verge of, in fact, already our Canadian government has donated $50.5 million towards embarking upon plutonium extraction. It's crazy. And I just want to, I just want to end, if I have a couple of minutes, I just would like to make a parallel here. I don't know if everyone listening to this has read Lord of the Rings, but in the Lord of the Rings, there is a ring, a magic ring of great power. But the thing is that when you, and it's almost irresistible, that when you slip it on your finger, you think you're going to have these wonderful powers. For one thing, you become invisible. And, but you discover that the ring, in fact, possesses you. You don't possess the ring. And so you become the possessed, and the ring is the possessor. And in order to destroy the ring, they have to find the most humble people on earth, who are the halflings of Middle Earth, because they're the only ones who are able to resist the lure of the ring and are able to destroy it. I like to think of this as a sort of a parable for our time, in that it's the ordinary people that have to provide leadership in getting rid of this nuclear menace. And the way to get rid of it, because it's an addiction. It's an addiction, and the powers that be are in the thrall of this addiction. And we have to mobilize ourselves and lobby and act, just as we have to act together to save the planet from climate change. We have to act together also to save the planet from this nuclear nightmare. Thank you.
Thank you, Gordon, and all the speakers. And we do have a bunch of questions coming in, so I'm going to fire off questions to each of you individually. This first one is from Dale Doer, and it's for Brenain. You said that there's no record for the traveling radioactive stuff. Do you mean that even the industry is not tracking its product? If I sent material to the USA for processing, wouldn't I be expected to receive a given volume back?
So the issue I raise is there's no registry of those waste movements. So I expect that the regulator tracks those shipments. I expect that. I expect that the waste producers track those shipments. I suspect that most of those shipments are being returned to the Chalk River laboratories under the management of Canadian Nuclear Energy Alliance, aka Canadian Nuclear Laboratories. So I expect they know that. But there's no transparency, there's no accountability, there's no public registry. And I believe very strongly that there should be a public registry. And I think it's really irksome that the way we know about these shipments is by going on the US Nuclear Regulatory Commission, their public registry, the Adams Registry. And on the Adams Registry, with certain searches, you can find the shipments of radioactive waste between Canada and the US, but we have no equivalent registry in Canada. And I think that's very problematic. I think it's just one example of the lack of transparency that we experience in Canada. And if you don't have transparency, you don't have accountability.
Thank you, Bernane. This is a question for Susan. Why are the nuclear marketing agents, including their scientists, researchers, nuclear engineers, seemingly winning the war of having their narrative accepted by government, regulatory bodies, and for what seems the public who are benefiting from nuclear energy?
So why are they being successful? And I think, well, we've tried to answer some of that, but I think the film actually gets into that, definitely. And Gordon touched on it on the end. There's this mythology around it. It's almost like an addiction. There's lots of reasons why Canada in particular wants to be a nuclear player. It gets a lot of benefits from being in the nuclear game internationally. And so it almost doesn't even have to make sense, because it doesn't make sense. I mean, if you look at what we've been talking about, and if you read the literature on it, it makes absolutely no sense. For example, like for a province like New Brunswick to be in the nuclear game, it makes no sense at all, but here we are. And so there's deeper reasons behind it. You know, you could say that the public utilities are hardwired for nuclear, and it's connected to a number of things. Vicki started to get into it when she was talking about the work at the university, and certainly Rolls-Royce, the connections with the military, for example, the military industrial complex. There's all kinds of reasons for it. But, you know, like I tried to say at the end, it looks like they're winning the war, and they certainly are right now, the war of words, the public relations battle. But, you know, I think we're mounting a good offense, and it's going to take a few years, but I think we're going to get there. But Bernane has something to add, it looks like.
Yeah, just briefly, one of the many things I really liked about Vicki's film was the great listing of authors and publications. And one that struck me that I paused it so I could get the name was Louis Gwynn's Speak No Evil, The Promotional Heritage of Nuclear Risk Communication. And there is a whole industry around risk communication, risk minimization. And I have a friend who says, I think somewhat cynically, no matter who you vote for, the government always wins. And I think we could paraphrase that and say, no matter who the government is, the nuclear lobby is always there. And they're always there from day one. And I think that you know, until we uncloak that, I think that we're going to continue to have these challenges. They're very well funded, and they've got a lot to gain.
Thank you, Bernane. Gordon, maybe you want to answer this one on health issues. We know that radiation damages cells and causes cancer and other diseases, and that nuclear stations like Pickering release tritium daily, routinely into a highly populated area. So how can governments buy into the nuclear stance that no one is harmed and not be protecting the public?
Well, one of the reasons why they get away with that is that there is a delay between cancer. When you have exposure to chronic exposure to low levels of radiation, it takes years for the health effects to show up. This is why it took so long, with such a great struggle, to get the tobacco companies finally to pin them to the wall in terms of proving that cigarette smoking caused tremendous number of lung cancers and other heart disease and arteriosclerosis and so on. The reason is because of that time delay. You don't see people smoking a cigarette and then peeling off over dead. They seem to be having a good time. And so for a long time, people bought into the idea that it might be nasty and disgusting, but it's relatively safe. Once the statistics were clearly shown, then it became very clear. Now, the problem with radiation is that as Alice Stewart, Dr. Alice Stewart showed, that a single abdominal x-ray to a pregnant woman during the first trimester could result in a 50% increase in leukemia among the children who were subsequently born to those women. And when she produced these results, she was attacked, much to her surprise, not by fellow doctors like nuclear medicine people, but she was attacked by the nuclear industry. And she realized the reason they were attacking her is because they had been telling people around the world that these levels of radiation are perfectly safe. So she said that in order to find radiation damage, you have to really want to. You have to go after it. You have to look for it. If you don't look for it and you just blur the statistics by not bothering to look into individual cases and following up individual cases of incidents of exposure and consequences, you'll never find it out. So what they can typically do is take too large a population so that the consequences are lost in the swirl of uncertainty from other causes. That's because they have not designed a study which is really wanting to find out what the effects on these people are. However, I should add, nevertheless, there have been a lot of evidence from many populations, medical patients, survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, people who have lived in certain communities, working people in mines and so on. And all of these studies have shown unequivocally that there is no safe level of exposure to radiation, that as the radiation exposure goes down, the number of cases goes down, but you still have radiation-induced cancers at any level of exposure.
Thank you, Gordon. Question for Vicki. Vicki, do you consider the love affair presented in your film an actual abusive relationship dominated by aggressive men?
Wow, that's a good question. I wouldn't know. Well, I wouldn't say that. In terms of the individual people I met, I would say my impression of everybody I met from the nuclear industry was that they're all operating in completely good faith. You know, I don't think anybody's getting up in the morning thinking that they're doing bad things. Everyone's very sincere, and you know, I don't know. I didn't find anybody aggressive. Sometimes some of the people were, I would say, a little bit defensive. You know, that protective of their industry, and at times maybe a little suspicious of why I was asking, really not so much why I was asking questions about the technology, because I think they're quite used to that. I think they were like freaked out sometimes that I was asking them how they felt about the technology. It was just because this, as I talk about the framing, you know, it was just, I was asking like, well, how do you feel about nuclear power? Why do you love it? You know, and they didn't, this was a strange question for them. I don't know. I mean, the love affair metaphor is somewhat tongue-in-cheek, I suppose. You know, I don't know. That's a very interesting question. And I have had a question that's come up quite a lot, which I guess is sort of what you're getting at, a kind of gender question. And in a way, I feel slightly embarrassed that it hadn't really occurred to me while I was making the film. But obviously, you know, I'm a female filmmaker. And a lot of people have asked me a kind of question about the sort of gendered nature of the technology and of the world. And yeah, I mean, maybe I'm not the person to talk about that, but you know, lots of people have pointed that out to me, and you know, said that maybe a man would not have looked at the technology, looked at this story in this way. I don't know. I will be thinking on that. Is it an abusive relationship? I don't know. I kind of feel like it's sort of, you know, in my mind, I guess the atom as the sort of eponymous hero is more of a kind of roguish kind of, you know, very dashing and sort of full of talk, rather than, you know, actively seeking to do harm. But I mean, I don't know. It'd be interesting to know what other people, you know, if other people have had that thought or that kind of interpretation.
Okay, if anybody else wants to comment, otherwise I'll just go right to the next question. This is from Alfred Meyer. Would the speakers comment on the concept that the driver of the nuclear power industry is the nuclear weapons industry, not the delivery of electricity? SMRs are really for the nuclear navy, for example, and this is why the UK is willing to go to such great lengths with Hickley Point, Unit C. It needs the civilian nuclear power's academic and industrial capacity in order to make nuclear weapons.
I'll just start that one. I think maybe we all might have some comments on it. I did mention that at least in the nuclear waste industry, we have several key players in Canada who are also connected with the nuclear weapons industry in the US. But the most clear example of answering that question was from Rolls-Royce in the UK, where they actually have printed materials that are publicly available, where they say that if they did not have their civilian nuclear division, they could not keep their military division going, because they need to train the personnel in the civilian nuclear division to have enough personnel to be able to run their nuclear division. Because if we didn't have a civilian nuclear industry, there just wouldn't be enough personnel to kind of keep the military industry alive. But maybe Bernane or Gordon might have something to add to that.
Well, yeah, I think it's undoubted that the nuclear industry began from the military. And I think it's undoubted too that a lot of the drive for the civilian use of nuclear power was to kind of legitimize, in a sense, the whole nuclear enterprise, so that it's not just a terrible curse. It's not just a horrific machine of annihilation, but can also be doing wonderful things for humanity, our friend the atom. And so a lot of it is a rehabilitation sort of thing, is to say, well, if we're going to have this monster in our midst, let's at least put on the Jekyll and Hyde sort of show that he's not always a monster, but sometimes he's friendly and good and giving you good things. I also do believe that in terms of logistics, in terms of the financing and all that stuff, that it wouldn't be possible for the peaceful nuclear industry to exist without the military industry behind it all. In fact, most of the countries that have bought CANDU reactors from Canada have at the time they bought them, they had distinct military desires. South Korea definitely had a desire to develop its own nuclear weapons. So did Argentina, so did India and did, so did Pakistan and did. These are all customers of ours. So I think that there's always been this strong connection. A lot of the countries who want to buy nuclear reactors, they want to have at least the possibility of developing nuclear weapons sometimes down the road. They don't have to, and it gives them a peaceful cover. It means they don't have to announce that they're embarked on a military nuclear weapons program right away. They can disguise it as a peaceful nuclear program. One final thought, and that is that I've often brought this up to people in the nuclear industry, and I said, why is it that no peaceful nuclear organization, such as the Canadian Nuclear Association, Atomic Energy of Canada Limited, the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, any of these organizations have ever come out against nuclear weapons? None of them. In other words, they claim that they're only interested in peaceful nuclear, but they are quite friendly with the nuclear militarists, and they go back and forth between the two fields freely, and they don't see any contradiction between it.
I could just add, I think Gordon and Susan has both spoken to the origins of the nuclear power industry are certainly in in the weapons industry. And I think those connections and that crossover has continued over the decades. You know, at one point, there was tritium removal facility was renamed tritium recovery facility because tritium is, you know, a weapons trigger, a weapons booster. So I think the industries are definitely linked, but I would say that I think at this point in time, the biggest driver of the nuclear power industry in Canada is the nuclear power industry in Canada and the nuclear lobby and the nuclear suppliers and consultants and engineering firms. That's what's driving it. And I think they're indifferent as to whether it's for weapons or power. I think that we're in the next sort of stage of this cloaking, though. Now we've had the nuclear weapons industry cloaked by the nuclear power industry for decades, but I think we're seeing increasingly the nuclear power industry is cloaking itself in the nuclear medical industry. And so we're seeing reactors in Ontario now producing medical isotopes. And I see that very much as a cloaking exercise on their part. I will say it's quite, my roots also are in the peace movement. And I have to say, I've been shocked in the last few years at the acceptance, the seeming acceptance of the Canadian government of this notion of reprocessing high-level waste and extracting plutonium. It's just shocking. It's something that I think a decade ago, I can't imagine the uproar there would have been, and yet it's happening. And that I think is that's a very serious concern. And you couple that then with the interest of all of the so-called SMR vendors in exporting these technologies around the world. I think that it's an absolute, it's a plan for proliferation, and that will include weapons proliferation.
I'd just like to demur a little bit of what Renee just said, because I don't think the push is really coming from the Canadian nuclear industry, although they're very fertile ground and they're very supportive of it and they cheer it. But it's really coming from outside. It's coming from the UK, it's coming from the US, it's coming from this multinational consortium that the Harper government turned our federal facilities over to the control of a multinational consortium of profit-making companies who have direct links to nuclear scandals in other countries. They have been found guilty of criminal charges. They have been found guilty of fraudulent and bribery, and some of these charges are directly related to the handling of nuclear waste at military nuclear facilities, like Hanford, where they produce the plutonium for the bombs in the USA, and Sellafield in Northern England, where they produce the bombs for the British program. So I do think the push is international. It's coming largely from close allies of the military, and they see Canada as a weak sister because we do not have the necessary organizations to do a proper peer review. In the States, for example, right now, they're getting the same pressure that we're getting. But in the States, they have the National Academy of Sciences, which is having its own investigation into the nature of reprocessing. In Britain, when they proposed the same thing, they had the House of Lords investigating it. Here in Canada, we have nobody investigating it. So the nuclear opportunists see Canada as a pushover because we don't have even the institutions needed to do a proper vetting and a proper independent look at these proposals.
I totally agree with all of that. I would just say right now, at this point, the nuclear industry, the nuclear lobby are, you know, it's hard to just make any distinctions. And I think it's an industry and a lobby that's completely colonized by all the forces that Gordon just mentioned. So I completely agree with Gordon.
Yeah, there's a question from Simon Daigle, and it's following up exactly what we're saying. This is like such an international lobby from militaries, from governments, from big corporations, international, multinational corporations. Are there any legal actions that we as an activist community can bring to stop public funds for the nuclear industry in Canada or abroad? Or is it like, where are the opportunities for us to break through? Is it legal? Is it strictly political?
We have an election coming up. You know, you have to be talking to your political candidates about this, at least raising. I mean, there's only two ways that these things are going to change. One is through the party politics, the political avenue, and we absolutely need change there. Although it's very difficult because the major parties in Canada are all pro-nuclear. But then we have, you know, social movements outside, and I think all of us on the panel here are very active in, you know, trying to do what we can to raise public awareness. That involves the cooperation of media, which isn't always there. So, you know, what can we do? I would say write about it, letters to the editor, you know, get the information out there, talk to your friends, because again, the more people that know what's going on, we believe will be against this. And the only way it's going to change is if the public shifts, there's more public pressure to stop it. Otherwise, the money's going to flow. There's $8 billion right now sitting in a federal, just one federal program that can be accessed by the nuclear industry in Canada. And that money is going to go to the industry unless there's pushback on it.
Yeah, I'd just like to say something on that. I think that the environmental movement itself is the one that led the way for our government to have departments of the environment. There were no departments of environment anywhere before the first Earth Day, when millions of people demonstrated in the streets. And the only way climate change has found its way to the top of some parties is because of widespread public activism. So I think it's really up to the general public to provide the leadership on this. We have to shame the parties, all of them, into recognizing that this is something that has to be dealt with and cannot be disregarded as another opportunistic sort of scheme to either get donations to their party or to curry favor with the industrialists, or to really disguise their real intentions. Because I believe that the fact that nuclear power is so slow and so expensive means that it's really a vote against climate change control. It's really investing in these nuclear reactors is saying we're not going to do anything about climate change for at least 10 years. That's what it really says. It really says we're going to kick the can down the road, and we're also going to spend your money giving it to these opportunists, these nuclear opportunists, knowing full well that they can't deliver the goods for 10 or 20 years, if ever.
And knowing full well that we have much lower cost alternatives, renewable alternatives, conservation. The world is moving to a renewable future. The International Energy Agency says 95% of new supply over the next 5 years is coming from renewable power. Meanwhile, Canada is going down this radioactive rabbit hole, which is many times more expensive. It really makes no sense. So we have to really politically get engaged in this issue. There is a question from Tom. The nuclear waste problem seems like an out of sight, out of mind problem. People in Ontario and New Brunswick have gotten used to living with nuclear waste in their backyard for years. For example, no one has died from nuclear waste. How do we make the waste problem tangible, real, and urgent?
Well, nuclear waste, people have died from nuclear waste. The only reason nuclear reactors are dangerous is because of the nuclear waste. When you have a Chernobyl accident, what you have is a release of radioactive waste. That's the material that's inside every nuclear reactor. It's just waiting to get out. So that the fact that it's false to say that it hasn't killed anybody. And killing people is not the main metric. You shouldn't think in terms of how many people it kills. You should think about how uninhabitable it makes the earth. How uninhabitable it makes, for example, the region around Chernobyl, the region around Fukushima, the contamination of the food and water supplies. This is more important than how many people are killed. I think the body count is the wrong metric to be thinking about. We're talking about sustainability. We're talking about keeping food that is edible, water that is drinkable, air that is breathable, and of course, the gene pool, protecting the gene pool. So I reject this idea that you compare alternatives simply by counting deaths. That's not the main That's not really the main point. And of course, the nuclear weapons elevates the whole thing to a completely different scale.
But I just add that I think that it's, you know, it's similar to the problem we were talking a few minutes ago about the public needs to step up. We need to step up. We have been dealing with a very, very well-funded and well-crafted public relations program for the entirety of the nuclear power sector's operations. And we need to unbundle that, and we need to step by step, you know, disclose that this isn't, you know, all is not well, and it's not well at every step along the line. Not only do they not have a long-term solution, they're not managing it very well in the short term. And this is all about increasing incremental risk for, you know, for the people in the area, for people along the transportation route, for the environment, and for generations and generations and generations to come. So it's slow, hard work, but that's what needs to be done. We need environmental literacy. We need nuclear literacy. And there are powerful forces pushing back against that, but that's what needs to be done.
I noticed a couple of things in the chat that I'd like to say something about, even though it hasn't been brought up by the chair, but somebody has asked about nuclear medicine and about how do we have nuclear medicine without nuclear reactors. In fact, medical isotopes have been produced and are produced by by methods that do not involve nuclear reactors or uranium in any way. Now, there are isotopes which are produced from nuclear reactors, but we've discovered other methods of producing them using non-nuclear methods. Well, non-nuclear in sense of fission, no fission involved. And that is using cyclotrons and linear accelerators. And there are a whole host of developments going on right now. Canada, for example, has stopped producing medical isotopes of the technetium-99 variety at Chalk River using reactors. But you're right, the power reactors are now trying to buy some public goodwill by producing medically useful isotopes. That isn't the only way to produce them. There are other ways to produce them that don't involve producing high-level radioactive waste and plutonium.
Thank you, Gordon.
There's another thing I just wanted to mention is that somebody else said, well, if you don't burn the plutonium up in a reactor, what do you do with it? When they put the plutonium into a reactor, they burn up only a part of it. They're left with 20% left over. You don't get rid of it that way. And the difficulty is that you're putting it into circulation, because the plutonium, in order to be used as a fuel, it has to be rendered into a commercial context. That's what makes it dangerous. What makes it dangerous is the stuff that falls between the cracks.
Gordon, thank you so much, and everybody. So we're just wrapping up. I would like to circle it back to Vicki for bringing us together. Thank you, Vicki, for your great work of art that you produced, historical art. I wonder if you could just close us out by telling us what the key moment in the film was for you.
Oh, wow. I'm very tired. Let me think.
Oh, yeah, I should just say that, you know, Vicki's in the UK. Is it 5 hours later than here?
Yeah,
So it's the middle of the night. Yeah. Thank you.
Moment in the film. Do you mean in the making of the film, or as in like what's actually up on the screen? Or
it's up to you. What inspired you? What
I would say, I mean, there were so many. I went through, and I was doing it for such a long time. I got, you know, had waves of kind of being really thinking, oh, it's really all about, you know, democracy. Like, is nuclear power actually something that really is only compatible in, you know, not necessarily, well, non-democracies or places like France with like incredibly centralized states. I got very interested in that for a while. I had kind of waves of different things I was interested in, but I guess because I landed on the metaphor thing, one of the things that, and my own experience of making the film and speaking particularly to the kind of nuclear people, was a chap who's in the film, Spencer Wirt, who is a science historian. He wrote this very, very interesting book that I think first came out in the, I want to say the 80s or maybe the 90s, but it was republished and kind of updated after Fukushima under a new title called The Rise of Nuclear Fear. And it was particularly about, I think the original title was something like a history of nuclear images or something. But it was kind of from him that he kind of crystallized something I was already thinking about, which was this thing of the kind of clash of worldviews. And that actually, because I kept coming again and again, it's like, why? I kind of don't get it. Like, why? It's the same technology. It's the same in the US, it's the same in France, it's the same in Canada. Wherever it's nuclear power is nuclear power. And yet it has such a different, people have such different views, understandings of it. It has a different experience, like what's going on. And obviously there's loads of different things going on. But one of the things that I found really interesting on a very, very kind of micro level was the personal stuff of why, where different people are coming from. And maybe that's useful in a kind of activism context to sort of understand, people who are advocating for nuclear power, are doing that because they really believe nuclear power is a good thing, I think. So yeah, I guess that book by Spencer Wirt was very influential on me and my thinking, and the ultimate kind of, overarching sort of metaphor and frame of how we looked at the story, I guess. I feel like that's quite rambly, but
Great.
So there was some kind of sense in that.
Thank you very much, Vicki. And
you guys, well, honestly, it's such a thrill. I feel like I'm tailing off, but it's a huge thrill for me, and it's been really, really interesting listening to everyone. Yeah, and as Angela said, it's the first time we've been able to show the film outside the UK. It's a shame. Well, I say it's a shame it's virtual. I mean, I don't think it would have been realistic for me to fly out to Canada anyway. So maybe we're lucky that we now have this kind of world of virtual screenings. It means we can all get together and you guys can enjoy the film. And I will plug for myself, if you're here on the webinar but you haven't watched the film yet, please watch the film. I'd love you to see it. And I think Angela put the link in the chat, didn't you, before?
And like I said, I will send out a follow-up email with contact information and links for all of the speakers, as well as the recording. You can share it with your friends. I am so grateful for the incredible knowledge all of the speakers shared with. Well, it's time's up. Is there anything
Okay.
you want to throw something in? Does anybody want to just?
I just want to say that I think that people are comfortable with nuclear because it's exciting, it's satisfying scientifically, it's filled with curiosity, it's got lots of problems. Scientists and engineers love to solve problems, and they feel it gives them a sense of satisfaction that they can control this fantastic force until they can't. And that's the whole problem, is that when something like Chernobyl happens, when something like Fukushima happens, when something like 3 Mile Island happens, when something like a nuclear bomb happens, people say, my God, I never thought it would come to this. And I think that there's a joke that sort of summarizes my feeling about why people lull themselves into feeling that this is perfectly safe. It's the man who jumped himself off the Empire State Building in New York City, and as he passes each floor on the way down, he says, I'm all right so far.
Great. Any other final comments, anyone? I'm sorry we didn't get to all the questions. Let's keep the conversation going. Thank you all for spending your evening with us, and especially to the panelists with great appreciation, and Brad for helping us with tech. Goodbye.
And to you, Angela, and to Vicki. Excellent.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you, Angela.
Thank you, Vicki.
Thank you.